For our third invited talk of the conference, we are thrilled to have Lauren Clemens. Lauren is no stranger to the AFLA community. She works extensively on Austronesian languages like Indonesian, Niuean, Sundanese, and Tahitian. A lot of Lauren's research looks at what prosodic information can teach us about questions in theoretical syntax, and her work has appeared in journals including NLT and Language. You'd also be interested to know that she drew the outrigger canoe in the AFLA logo that has been used in recent years. Lauren received her PhD in 2014 at Harvard University. Her dissertation sheds light on the mysteries of verb initiality with fascinating insight from prosody fieldwork on verb initial Austronesian languages, especially Niuean. Lauren is currently an assistant professor in the program in Linguistics and Cognitive Science in the Department of Anthropology at University of Albany, SUNY. Besides Austronesian languages, her cross-linguistic research extends to Mayan and Bantu languages, and more recently, Copala Triqui, which is an Otomanguean language of Mexico. Today, Lauren will share with us her work on Niuean and Tongan. Her talk is titled Absolute Movement in Polynesian, Syntactic Ergativity, and Post-Verbal Word Order Variation. Let's welcome Lauren Clemens.
Thank you. And thank you so much to the organizers who, in addition to organizing a virtual conference, are teaching us all how to do it right. So this is really great. It means a lot to me to be here. AFLA at Stony Brook was the place that I gave my first conference presentation as a graduate student many years ago. So this is, and for other reasons, I have sentimental feelings about AFLA. Okay, so everybody can see my slides. Okay, so in this talk, I provide a unified account of ergative subject extraction restrictions, which is one manifestation of syntactic ergativity, as well as variable verb initial word order variable post-verbal word order in the Polynesian languages, Niuean and Tongan, based on a well-established finding that syntactic ergativity can arise from the locus of absolutive case assignment. And I'll also promote a particular view of the so-called standard theory of syntactic ergativity that is based on a preference for nested as compared to cross dependencies. And this talk combines aspects from a couple of new papers written with Becky Collin, who is present and should wave. I can't actually see everybody, but I assume I think she's here. And so thanks to Becky. Okay, so as I said, this talk is about Niuean and Tongan, which together make up the Tongic branch of the Polynesian side of the Austronesian family. I'm mentioning Niuefo'o here under the Samoan languages by name because in some quite reputable sources, it is listed as a Tongic language when in fact similarities to Tongan arise from geographic proximity, and it is in fact a Samoan language. So I just want to flag that because I know a couple of you have seen a version of this talk where we talk about Niuefo'o as well. All right, so my main focus today is to analyze a correspondence between two ways in which the Tongic languages vary. And the first is the ability or inability of the ergative argument to undergo a-bar movement, which, as I said, is a known hallmark of syntactic ergativity. And we find evidence for this type of syntactic ergativity in Tongan, but not Niuean. And then I connect this trait with the availability or lack thereof of post-verbal word order variation. And so while Niuean word order with 2 full DPs is strictly VSO, Tongan allows both VSO and VOS. All right, so the goals for the talk are going to be to argue that T is the locus of absolutive case for Tongan, while it is lower for Niuean. And we're going to talk about new data from coordination to support this. I may refer to Tongan as a high absolutive language and Niuean as a low absolutive language for this reason. And then I will also present an account of syntactic ergativity based on the grammaticalization of a processing-based preference for nested as compared to cross-dependencies. And then I will connect the location of apps to the availability of VOS order. And this is the order of things. All right, so turning to the ergativity data. All right, so Niuean and Tongan are both morphologically ergative head marking languages. And I think this is well known, but AFLA is student friendly, so I'm going to go through even some of the basic data fairly quickly. So here's a chart summarizing Tongic case markers, including Proto-Tongic. And you can see that these case markers are largely cognate, but in practice, each case marking system reveals its own nuance. So if we look at Tongan, we can see that the subject of the intransitive clause in 4a has the same case marker as the object of the transitive clause in 4b, which is why it is glossed absolutive. Niuean has two different case marking series. One is for common nouns, and one is for proper nouns or pronouns. So the absolutive marker with common nouns is A, and which is the ergative marker for proper nouns. So that can be a little bit confusing. So just trust that if you aren't familiar with Niuean, trust that the glosses are probably correct, even though we see some what can be confusing data. All right. So then in a subset, so both Tongan and Niuean are morphologically ergative. And then in a subset of morphologically ergative languages, ergative subjects are unable to undergo one or more type of A-bar movement. And these languages are described as syntactically ergative. And this is really, this movement restriction is arguably the hallmark of syntactic ergativity. And the Tongic languages differ on this dimension. So Tongan has ergative subject extraction restrictions. So the ergative subjects do not restrict or do not extract in the same way that absolutives arguments do. And Niuean does not have these restrictions. So Otsuka has shown that absolutive arguments relativize with a gap in Tongan. So if we look at 7a, A Pifine is co-indexed with a gap in the position where you might otherwise expect to find an absolutive argument in the relative clause. But notice that in 7b, it is co-indexed with a resumptive pronoun in the position associated with ergative arguments. The point is that for some syntactic process, in this case relativization, absolutive and ergative arguments are treated differently, and this is why we call Tongan syntactically ergative. Niuean does not have this feature, so both arguments, both the absolutive and the ergative arguments relativize with a gap. All right. Then more evidence that Tongan is a syntactically ergative language comes from the so-called raising construction. The actual analysis of this construction isn't super important. What is important is that it involves an argument that surfaces in one clause that's interpreted in another. And as we see in 9a, the absolutive argument freely appears as the clause mate of raising verbs. Okay, so in naughty, so we see naughty children in 9a, and the surfaces in the higher clause, even though its theta role is assigned in lower clause, which we know because it's associated with the absolutive gap in the lower clause. But if we try to associate a raised DP with an ergative gap in the lower clause, it doesn't work. And again, Niuean is different in this respect because it doesn't differentiate between ergative and absolute arguments in this respect, and the raising construction, right, works in either case. All right, so Tongan displays both morphological and syntactic ergativity. That's the point. Niuean shows morphological ergativity, but none of the telltale signs of syntactic ergativity. And then in the next two sections, I'm going to develop an account of syntactic ergativity, which will then extend to post-verbal word order variation. Okay, so I'll begin by talking about ergative case assignment. So we maintain that ergative case assignment applies uniformly in both languages. and is assigned by little v to external arguments. So this is not a new idea. And it looks something like this. All right, so our account of absolutive case for these two languages is different. So it's different in Niuean and Tongan. And it's based on this well-established finding that the locus of absolutive case is a point of cross-linguistic variation. So for Tongan, we're going to say that the would-be absolutive argument moves to T to become a real absolutive argument. And for Niuean, absolutive case is assigned in situ. So the objects, for example, doesn't move for case. All right, so for Tongan, absolutive is assigned locally by T. The direct object moves past the ergative DP to be local with T and get absolutive case. So this is really important. And again, I'm reiterating things that have been said about different languages with respect to where when absolutive is assigned at T, what implications does this have for the ergative argument? So the object moves past the ergative argument to get absolutive case. And the position of the absolutive argument relative to the ergative argument renders the ergative argument inaccessible. And this is used to account for ergative extraction restrictions in a diverse range of unrelated ergative absolutive languages. So I've given some examples of accounts in different languages that rely on this idea that the ergative argument is trapped. These proposals are related. This is called the standard theory of syntactic ergativity by Deal. So it's a useful way to refer to those accounts that talk about the position of the absolutive argument as being important for what prevents the ergative argument from extracting. So anyway, so these different accounts have that in common, but they differ in terms of the specific facts they're trying to explain in the individual languages, and also the mechanisms they invoke to explain why the ergative argument is trapped. And this is where what I'm going to present is new. So we're going to argue that syntactic ergativity, or that trapping of the ergative argument, is connected to the preference for cross-dependencies. All right, so many people have noted for a long time that nested dependencies are more common cross-linguistically than cross-dependencies. So in 13, we have crossing dependencies in 13a and nested dependencies in 13b. And by way of explanation for this typological generalization, the processing literature offers evidence that cross-dependencies incur a greater cost when compared to nested dependencies. I also want to make a nod to pre-minimalist theories that account for different syntactic phenomena by appealing to contrast between different configurational paths of movement and the resulting outputs yielded by those paths. So Kane proposed that certain structural relations considered in terms of should be considered in terms of pathways from one syntactic node to another, and couched in that framework, Pozetsky proposes the path containment condition, which posits that overlapping movement paths must be contained within one another. So one formalization that you see that has a lot of traction, I mean, all of these ideas are obviously connected, but we're latching onto this, and it's the CCD, or the constraint on crossing dependencies, which posits that no movement dependency may cross another movement dependency. What we take this to mean, and it is important to specify that, is that this constraint applies to the interaction between A and A bar movement chains. So for example, we are not saying anything about head movement. All right, so then on our view, this CCD, which again is the constraint on crossing dependencies, is a general processing constraint which presents differently in the context of the grammar of different languages. So I'll explain how this is going to work. Certain languages have a fully grammaticalized version of the CCD. And a subset of those languages with the fully grammaticalized CCD are ergative absolutive languages. And a subset of those are high abs languages. And for those languages, the extraction of the ergative argument would result in an ill-formed cross-dependency, and that is why it's not allowed. So, show how this works. So essentially what we're saying is that we can reduce ergative extraction restrictions in Tongan to the grammaticalization of the constraint on crossing dependencies. So this is a fairly stylized illustration, but if the absolutive argument moves past the ergative argument for case, the A bar movement of the ergative argument, were this to occur, would end up crossing the A movement path of the absolutive argument. And because crossing dependencies are dispreferred, the movement of the ergative argument is disallowed. All right, so in this talk, I'm not so much providing arguments in favor of our worldview for how the locus of high abs language renders the ergative argument inaccessible to movement. I just wanted to let you know what we're thinking. Those arguments are available other places, but I will say, or just, I don't know, point to some benefits to our approach. And this includes the ability to account for a wide range of typological observations, including the relative rarity of syntactic accusativity as compared to syntactic ergativity, because if you extract the accusative after moving the nominative, you don't end up crossing the movement path because the accusative argument is generated below the nominative argument. Restrictions on the extraction of high applicatives as compared to the availability of prepositional object extraction and ditransitives for Mayan languages. That's really Mayan specific, but has to do with the predictions of this account. And then also an asymmetry in the acceptability of WH questions form from double object passives in nominative accusative languages. But none of this really has anything to do with Austronesian, so I'm going to get back on track. Okay, so interim summary then is that absolutive case is assigned by little v in Niuean, but by t in Tongan. And whether a language is subject to ergative extraction restrictions depends on how case is assigned. And then if the absolutive argument moves around the ergative argument can't undergo extraction because doing so would result in a cross dependency. So the next thing that I'm going to do is talk about post-verbal word order variability in Tongan and Niuean based on the position of the absolutive argument. All right, so word order and locus of absolutive argument. All right, so for Tongan, in transitive clauses with two DP arguments, both VSO and VOS occur, although VSO is the more discourse neutral option. So what I should have probably told you many, many slides ago is that I'm trying to remember to mark the absolutive argument in bold. So you can see that 14a is a VSO example, the absolutive is in bold and is at the end, and then we can reverse the order of the subject and the object. So that's that. And what we want to say is that a movement of the object in Tongan VOS is a reflex of absolutive case assignment. So the base position of the object, which is the VP, follows the subject or is lower than the subject, which is generated little VP. The case position of the object, so where the object moves to receive case, the TP precedes the subject or is higher than the subject. And so we're going to connect that to the VSO and VOS orders. So the idea is that the object can be pronounced in either syntactic position, either the base position or the case position. And then the choice between the two is discourse driven. And we're reanalyzing facts that have been established in the literature, or providing, an alternative explanation. So VSO here is shown when the object is pronounced in its base position, and this would mean that case movement would be covert. because it still receives absolutive case. When VOS surfaces, the object is being realized in its case position. All right. So Otsuka argues that Tongan VOS is a scrambling, and our account is largely consistent with hers in this respect. So we adopt many of those findings. So she finds that the object must undergo a movement into VOS position because VOS word order does not give rise to weak crossover effects, and this is shown in 16a. And that's the opposite of what we would expect if VOS order were derived by A-bar movement. Furthermore, binding relations are altered, so the subject cannot bind the object in VOS order. An ergative argument binds the absolutive argument in VSO order, which isn't shown here, actually, but the same bound reading is unavailable in VOS order, which is what 16b shows. I also want to advertise what I think, I actually should have double-checked this. What I can do is advertise a paper, whether or not this is a talk that will happen at this conference. It is a paper that will appear, written by Polynesian and Potsdam, who argue that VOS in Tongan involves a clause final subject topic. And they argue that information structural considerations support the existence of the right side topic, and that specifically this is derived by right word movement on the basis of connectivity with respect to case and binding and lack of clitic doubling. And what I want to say about that is that our account would gladly coexist with base generated right side topic account. So we think that it's possible that there are multiple ways to derive VOS order in verb initial languages. And I'm predisposed to that position because I've argued that much from Mayan. It is less clear how we could accommodate right word movement of the subject because that would result, for us, that would result in a cross dependency, which is a problem for our account. So I'm just responding to other analyses of VOS. Before we go in Tongan, before we turn to Niuean. All right, so turning to Niuean, the word order and transitive clauses with 2 DP arguments is VSO. Pseudonoun incorporation is not under consideration. We're just looking at case marked arguments. So 17 shows that you can have VSO, but you can't invert the order of the object and the subject the way you can with Tongan. So I'm showing you a similar tree to what we saw for Tongan. So the object is in its base position, which is also its case position. So the object is pronounced in that position, which is how you end up with VSO. VOS is not available. The object does not move to that higher position. So to wrap up this section, so in Tongan, ABS objects are associated with these 2 positions. We have on one hand a low base position and also a high case position. And objects can be pronounced in either position, which renders VSO and VSO and VOS order. In Niuean, though, absolutive objects are associated with a single position. So it's just a low base position, which is also the case position. And so VSO is the only option. Okay, so the variable position of absolutive in Tongan and Niuean accounts for the presence and absence of extraction restrictions, as well as the unavailability of VOS. And so that is, how we're connecting these 2 properties. I'm going to turn to coordination, and I'm following that grand tradition of talks where you do all the things that work out really nicely, and then you end with something that is interesting, and there's a lot of promise there, but it's not fully worked out. So that's what's happening right now, just so you know. But we're going to look at coordination because it tells us more about the locus of absolutive. Okay, so data from coordination seem to support an analysis where absolutive case is assigned high for Tongan but low for Niuean. Both of these languages have 2 different types of coordination. The first one is cognate, so mo or moe and nuean. And the second one, pea and si for nuean. And these two sets of two connectives pattern similarly. So the moe and pea si, right? Okay, so they coordinate phrases of different sizes, and this is true for Tongan. It was again established by Utska for Tongan, and it is true for Niuean as well, as it turns out. So in Tongan, pea but not mo can be followed by a tense marker or a clausal conjunction. It doesn't need to be. I mean, pea doesn't need to be, but it can be. And this suggests that pea includes T, while mo does not. So in 19A and 19B, we have two examples where we can use pea, but not mo, because what the second conjunct includes T and level T and up material. Nuean C works like pea, and it can be followed by a tense marker or a clausal conjunction. So we just sort of, replicated these data points for Nuean. Moe cannot be. And again, it should say C includes T while mo does not. There's a copy and paste error there. But the punchline is that pea and C work very similarly. All right, so now, right, okay, so I should have had like a concluding statement. Pea and C coordinate conjuncts that are at least as big as T, and moe is smaller than C. All right, so this is the neat pattern. So if the second conjunct is missing a participant, it's necessarily interpreted as a subject of the first conjunct. And this is Nuean data, and it is what Dixon has called an accusative coordination pattern. I want to flag that. We're not going to don't think too hard about that. But that's what has been called an accusative coordination pattern. So what happens here is that we have in the first conjunct, so sione chased mele and laughed has to mean that sione laughed. It cannot mean that mele laughed. This seems very natural to English speakers, obviously, and the same is true for C. So it has to mean that sione laughed. So the missing participant in laugh is going to be interpreted as whatever the subject is in the first conjunct. The Tongan pattern is different and interesting. This is what has been called the ergative coordination pattern by Dixon. But again, I'm just flagging that, but we'll move on. So if the second conjunct is missing a participant, the antecedent is the subject of conjunct 1 with mo, so just like in Nuean. But with pea, we find case matching instead. So we have this super neat minimal pair where 22A means Hina hit mele and Hina laughed. So Hina hit mele and Hina laughed. But 22B is different. So it means Hina hit mele and mele laughed. Those are parentheses around my head. So what happens now is that laugh needs to have, the participant needs to be interpreted as something that would have the same case for it to actually have an argument expressed. All right. So the intuition that we're trying to capitalize on is that it's precisely when conjuncts that include T are coordinated that we find a difference between Tongan and Nuean. And that is the theme of the whole presentation. So the syntactically ergative coordination pattern doesn't surface unless T is involved. And this is consistent with the idea that absolutive on T is responsible for syntactic ergativity in Tongan. Tongan T is responsible for absolutive case assignment. Nuean T is not. All right, so I'm going to sketch an initial analysis. And here are some components, but also assumptions. So in Moe coordination, this is true for Tongan and Niuean, the coordination is so small that the external argument position is part of the material that is shared between the two conjuncts. So the external argument position is above the point of conjunction. In Pea-C coordination, there's an actual empty category in the second conjunct, and it finds its antecedent in C commanding DP from the shared material. I'm going to sketch out trees in a second. Something else that is important, as you will see, is that we are not assuming, or we are adopting Johnson's arguments about gapping, that the coordinate structure constraint does not apply to a movement here. Okay, so if we start with Moe coordination for Niuean, what we have is the coordinate phrase sits below the position of the external argument. And so the only interpretation of 23 that's available is one in which the external argument is associated with the predicate of the second conjunct, because otherwise we have a theta criterion violation, because the verb, which I'm not showing, needs to assign its theta role. And so in this case, it's going to be to a sione. Something about interpreting these trees. I decided to leave out the verbs. So don't worry about where the verb is. I just think it's clearer if you're paying attention to where the arguments are, because we're talking about the postverbal arguments. Okay, so then if we look at Mo coordination for Tongan, we see effectively the same thing. So the second verb, kata, doesn't have, isn't associated with an external argument position inside of that conjunct. So it looks to the shared material between the conjuncts for the external argument. So this has to be interpreted as hina hit mele and laughed. But otherwise, everything else proceeds as normal in the first conjunct, moving into the shared material. Okay, now looking at C. Now we have the coordinate phrase that is higher. And we have C coordinating to, this is coordinating at the T bar level. We have the external argument position inside the conjunct. I'm showing this with an empty category. And then this now is looking for a C commanding antecedent. And now something that I've added here is that the ergative argument is moving into the specifier of TP from the first conjunct. So this is still the subject, now that is going to be interpreted as a subject of laugh, because esione is the C commanding DP outside, that C commands the empty category. And at this point, I imagine you can anticipate what I'm going to say next, which is the reason why we say, why this means sione chase mele and sione laughed for Niuean, is because if any argument moves that high, it's going to be the ergative argument, but with Tongan, it's the absolutive argument. So for this one specific, I mean, I'm just looking at one type of example, it's the absolutive argument that moves into the specifier of TP that is now C commanding the trace of the empty category in the second conjunct. So the difference between Niuean and Tongan is essentially what is moving into the specifier of TP. It's case-driven movement of the object in the specifier of TP for Tongan, which is why we have hina hit mele and mele laughed. Okay, so there are a lot of questions that I don't have answers to. So in many respects, the account of coordination is preliminary. Okay, we need to know more about what happens with little pro, but there is a really interesting prediction that I'm excited to look into. So we predict that Mo and C and Pea are different with respect to whether they can host pro as an external argument. Because when we're looking at the Mo coordination, there's no place for the potential of a little pro in the second conjunct, which basically means that we cannot force an like let's imagine, I don't know, Anna is super salient in the discourse. With mole coordination, we shouldn't be able to force an interpretation where Anna is the subject of laugh, because there is no space for this little pro argument here. But that should be different for C and Pele and Pea for both languages, because there is that space for little pro. So given the right context, we should be able to get a reading where Sione chist Mele and Anna laughed, because we're talking about Anna or whatever. So that's something that we really need to see, because the count makes different predictions about how pro works. We also need to know more about unaccusatives. So I've shown examples with unergatives, and this is just not something we have adequate data on for now, but be interesting to hear your ideas. I think there was something else. Well, that's fine. I really booked it through the first half of this presentation, so I'm gonna end a little bit early. But that's okay, I imagine. Okay, so we've put together an account of morphological ergativity in Yuan and Tongan that draws from pre-existing sources. And then we demonstrate how it explains the presence of syntactic ergativity in Tongan and the absence of syntactic ergativity in Yuan. This is not our intellectual contribution here. It's so widespread as to be called the standard theory of syntactic ergativity. What is new is the explanation for why the absolutive argument traps the ergative argument. The next thing that we did was to connect the location of absolutive case in Tongan to the availability of VOS word order, even when, especially when, only when, this is only relevant when the object is a full DP marked with absolutive case. And this word order is unavailable in Yuan, which we also accounted for. And then I wrapped up by sketching an account of this third difference between Yuan and Tongan that occurs when this high connective is used, Pea or Tsi, and arguing that the difference has to do with whether or not the phrase that it is being conjoined is high enough to include T. And to my knowledge, this is a first attempt to account for the so-called ergative coordination pattern by appealing specifically to the locus of case assignment. But it's an attempt, I recognize that. AFLA inspired the attempt to really do this. Okay, so in any event, we see this project is contributing to our understanding of cross-linguistic typology of ergativity and syntactic ergativity particularly, and also lending further support to analyses of syntactic ergativity that rely on a movement of the absolutive object in order to account for them. So the last thing I'll say is that this project brings light to ways in which languages from within a single subfamily can exhibit microvariation, and how seemingly unrelated phenomena like word order and movement restrictions, and also perhaps coordination patterns, may be connected through a single parametric difference. We'd like to go on to look at starting with more Polynesian languages to see, not all of these Polynesian languages are even morphologically ergative, but to see how far this type of analysis can go. So I will end there. Oops, I changed my screen so I could see all of your faces, and now I can't see my own slides. Hold on a second, because I want to say thank you to these people. I found one picture of Becky and me. Unfortunately, it was doing field work. Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We have about 18 minutes for questions. All right, Diane has a question. Diane, can you mute yourself, please?
Sorry, I was focusing on the video and forgot to mute. Thank you. That was a really great talk. I really like what you guys are doing. I do have a point, though, about your claim that the absolutive is assigned in C2 in Nguyen, because raising sort of shows that there has to be an absolutive position other than the base position, because you can raise to absolutive, whether that be an O or an S absolutive. That's one sort of problem that you have to deal with. But of course, you know, raising requires its own analysis. But then I also wondered in terms of the crossing, and I don't know this, but whether you can question an ergative from a lower clause after the object has received ECM absolutive from the higher verb. So something like, who did Mele lezioni that help, or who did Mele begin to help, where Mele is not the agent of help, but the patient. So you raise the object and you question the subject from the lower clause. Very possibly those are ungrammatical, and that would be great for you, but I don't actually know, so that might be something for you to look at. And then I have just two little other tiny points. One
Can I
is
respond before I forget, Diane?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I can ask my question later after other people.
No. I still want to hear it. I just wanted to say, so thank you for that. We need to look into it. The first point, yeah, so for us, it's true. I might have oversimplified and hammered too hard on movement versus no movement. I think that there's space for a short movement to fit in that doesn't end up, and other arguments for thinking that maybe the absolutives have to move somewhere internal to little VP. So that doesn't strike me as being such an insurmountable issue. But yes, I was painting with fairly bold strokes, I guess. But yeah, and thank you for the data point. Okay, the other points you wanted to make?
Oh, I did. These are just comments really for you, but I have seen examples of moe with a tam, embedded tam in the literature, and I don't know whether, there's not very many, so maybe you're right that it's ungrammatical and these are just sort of accidents, but I think you should push on that a little bit more with your consultants, because there are examples in stories and books that are written in Nguyen. And the other point is that,
like, sorry, do you feel like these are things that you've come across in corpora, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, like kua and also the future marker to. I've seen them after moe.
Okay.
But statistically, there's so many fewer than there are the other type that they may just be, you know, sort of accidents. And one last point quickly, it seems to me from my, you know, searches of many hundreds of examples of moe that it never takes a prepositional phrase. And I think that's because it is itself a preposition, but it's something for you to think about, because you would want to have an explanation for that if it's in fact true.
Okay. Thank you so much. And that actually sounds familiar to me, like maybe I've heard you say that many years ago.
Yes, I have said it in a couple of pages, so yeah.
Okay.
But it's a fact. I mean, I don't really, you know, it's something for you to, maybe you'll come up with a great analysis of it.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yi-Ning has a question.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I wanted to ask what other kinds of differences we might expect between the high absolutive and the low absolutive in Tongan. So, you know, if meaning the moved absolutive. And so if it moves, like maybe we'd expect it to take wider scope for quantifiers. So I'm just wondering what other kinds of effects you might expect for the moved one versus the non-moved one.
That's a great question. So one of the things that, and I guess I may also, just so you know, I'm just going to be watching Becky. If she wants to add anything to what I've said, I'm going to let her do it. So maybe unmute yourself. So one of the things that is really lacking at this point is, for us, is the Tongan fieldwork. So that's where we're at, that we need to be doing more work following through on predictions with speakers of Tongan, which I mean, as you can tell, the Tongan examples are coming from the literature.
Yeah, scope is one of the things we plan to look at.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Copa has a question.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering about the status and I guess distribution of the empty category that you posited. And in particular, I guess I was wondering about why, given that you adopt this Johnson idea, couldn't you say that it is a trace and you have across the board movement? Or what goes wrong?
Yeah, I mean, right. So I was using empty category in a super non-committal way because this is really new. It could very well be that we want to make that argument. So somehow saying that this is a trace is a little bit more of a commitment than E. I meant E to be something more like generic, like something that can really be co-indexed with something higher. But so offhand, I don't see any reason why we couldn't. And then it should be able to be in complementary distribution with little growth.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I could think of is that you might get different predictions depending on whether or not that empty category has different, like what case it has. Although I guess it seems like a prediction that your account makes anyway is that the mo conjuncts, the second conjunct shouldn't have abs in it.
Yeah. So this is, I was looking for this bullet point on that slide. I didn't include it. So the other thing we need to do, and we have ideas about this, is how to explain, we do get abs in places where we don't necessarily predict it in the second conjunct. And it's possible that the different ideas that we have, like maybe this is about multi-dominance, maybe this is about some sort of default case where it may matter that whether or not this is a trace, like depending on what we want to appeal to account for those absolutive, surprise absolutives in the second conjunct. Depending on what we want to say about that, it may actually matter whether this is a trace or some other empty category. But the types of, something that occurred to me is that it's a little bit like where you get those instances of absolutive case in the second conjunct that isn't really licensed. It's a little bit like the inverse of those cases from Germanic, where you get the dative subject and then the verb, and then like whatever the normal case is supposed to be in the second conjunct, and then it's reversed. So I'm thinking like there are examples from Icelandic and German in the literature where the order of the conjunct determines what the case is, because it seems to sort of like revert to its, I don't have these, I don't think I can construct them on the spot, but it seems to revert to whatever the case would be as if the entire structure was there, and it's not. I see some heads moving. Sorry, that was too obscure. But anyway, so that's another idea about like what is causing this absolutive, this unlicensed absolutive. And yes, this point about what the nature of that position is going to help us constrain the way that we will account for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Mitchell has questions.
Thanks, Lauren. I mean, I had CCD questions, but now I'm thinking about your conjunctions. So let's stay there. I'm just curious, this is sort of a data question for Tongan or Niuean. I think all your examples have like the transitive first and then the intransitive, right? And so what do we know about other combinations? I'd just be curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to tell you what I know about other combinations, but there are, on the Zoom call, people with more access to Tongan and Niuean data than me. So I am not territorial. Feel free to jump in if I say something that's incomplete or inaccurate. But the basic case for Niuean is that if there is some sort of unexpressed participant, it's always going to be understood as a subject no matter what. With with Tongan, with the higher connective, it will match case. There's one example that we could find that was a little bit puzzling. So where you have a transitive, two transitives, and an unexpressed participant and the second conjunct, and it's understood, and it's actually, I'm sorry, this is complicated to picture if you don't have the examples in front of you, but you have, verb, ergative, absolutive, conjunct, and then the absolutive verb, but the verb's transitive. So when there's something, but then in other cases, it seems like with two transitives, you get an ergative argument in the second conjunct. And so there's some, I mean, I don't want to call it inconsistency because I assume that there's an explanation, but the data with Pea and Tongan in particular with two transitives points to something that looks a little bit like it may have to do with, I don't know, the plausibility of what is like what could be an agent and what needs to be a theme, like something to do more with thematic relations as opposed to the structural count that we're aiming for. But the general pattern is that in Niuean it's grammatical function, and in Tongan it's grammatical function for Mo, but case matching for Does that answer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the cases where the interpretation of the null argument, I guess, right? So if you actually have it, in the cases where it would be backwards, right? Those cases could be interesting to look at in relation to Copa's question, right? We might wonder about the derivation of these things, especially if you're considering, some kind of across the board movement kind of derivation as well, right? How you then, right? Is it possible to ever do that and then linearize things in the right conjunct, right? Which, I mean, in a Johnson type account of gapping, I don't think that kind of thing happens. It would feel surprising to me, but I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Yeah.
I'm looking away from you because I'm writing it down.
No. Yeah, of course. Although, I mean, for Tongan, I mean, your movement is covert, and that may. I have questions about that, but I can ask later. Other people should ask questions. So, yeah.
I think there's a question from Josina. Josina?
Hi, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah, I had thanks Lauren and Becky as well. I had an open question more of if you could share what you think the discourse effects are beyond the base generated low topic of, because you said that the difference between the word orders is due to discourse effects, but then so I was wondering if you could go a bit more into that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something, I'm not the right person to go more into that because the Tongan data is coming from the literature. What I will say is that, there's some disagreement about, or just not, I don't know, conflicting reports about what the discourse status is, and it seems like the consensus view is it has to do with the prominence of the object.
Okay.
But I believe I should have actually looked at what Eric and Masha are talking about tomorrow in advance. They may argue something different tomorrow. Eric, give me a thumbs up if you're on the call, and that's right. So I think you're going to hear. There you go. Okay, good. Okay, so you'll hear more about that in more detail.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Elena has a question.
Yeah, this is really small, and I think I know what the answer is. But if you have your Tongan coordination with Pea, and you change the word order in the first conjunct, does that change anything in terms? No, it's always going to be the abs, no matter what position it appears in.
Well, so we were careful at one point to look through to make sure that we were like looking at different types of. I mean, I guess I shouldn't shake my head so quickly. There was a point where we looked into this and it did not seem to be relevant, but I don't have like a perfect checkbox for you. There's actually, you know, there's great documentation and description of these types of conjuncts, but that doesn't seem to be relevant. And again, I'm open to being corrected.
Anyone else has questions? We have a little bit more time. Yes, Ming Vong. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
I have a question. Thank Laurent for your talk. Regarding coordination, the Tongan and Niuean, how many coordination did you compare between the two languages? I mean, the data, right? The data from coordination.
Do you mean in terms of like how many conjuncts?
I mean the data from coordination of the two languages.
Yeah. So we looked at the coordination of clauses of different sizes, including ones that I didn't talk about, but the only ever two conjuncts, and so that. Then I will take this to imply that we should consider larger coordinate structures, and that seems like an interesting thing to do. Thank you. Yeah, also if, you know, maybe now or when it's officially 9 o'clock, I'm curious to know how coordination works in your favorite Polynesian language in particular.
If anyone has any last questions. Yes, you go, Otsuka.
Thank you, Lauren. It was really, can you hear me? It was really good and very interesting. I have a question about this lower abs analysis of Tonga, as you might expect. So one of the diagnostics that people have used for this lower absolutive is that the absolutive is not available in infinitival or, you know, defective T clauses, right? And absolutive, as you can see in that raising construction that you mentioned, absolutive is available in these non-finite, I don't know, depending on what you call it, but it's not fully tensed clauses. How do you account for that fact in your lower abs analysis?
Yeah, so, you know, we don't currently account for that fact, but what I would say sort of on the fly is that I think this probably is going to be connected to the fact that we get absolutive in this case where it seems unlicensed in the coordination, and probably we'll want to tie those two things in together and maybe have to say something like, resort to saying something like a default. I mean, it's not very elegant, but I appreciate you pointing that out because, you know, it's not the only case where we get abs in a not strictly speaking licensed environment.
Yeah, no,
better
that's
than Ergative, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. So either way, right? Ergative is also available. So it's very mysterious. So yeah, but I mean, I think your analysis is very, very interesting. I want to look at Tongan data more carefully. If I may comment on that pair transitive coordination,
yeah,
what happens is, I think the constraint or the observation I made was the possible antecedent And so when the gap is in the absolutive in the second conjunct, it can only refer back to the absolutive argument of the first conjunct. Mm-hmm. If the gap is ergative, then it can only refer back to the ergative. So that's why I call it the case matching constraint. Yeah, but I mean, it could also, it's a very rare cases, right? Transitive pair with the gap, especially in naturalistic speech. So yeah, it could potentially plausibility, probability, what is more likely to be agent in this as a combination with the verb. Mm-hmm. But I think it would be very interesting to look into that. Thank you.